Happy Easter once more. It's Wednesday. Yesterday we thought about the new hope which Christ's resurrection has brought us and of how it can be ours for the asking. Today we're going to think about joy, the joy which flows into the world from the risen Christ. Many hearts were bursting with joy in that first Easter week, and this joy is to take possession of our hearts too. According to St. Matthew's account, when Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb very early on Easter Day, they found the stone rolled away, and they saw a figure in dazzling white who told them that Christ was risen from the dead and that he would meet his disciples again in Galilee. Then, St. Matthew says, the women went away quickly from the tomb, their hearts filled with awe and great joy, and ran to give the news to his disciples. But quite suddenly, Jesus stood before them in their path and said, "Peace be with you." And they went forward to meet him and, clasping his feet, worshipped him. Just imagine the joy in their hearts at that moment. That same evening, Jesus suddenly appeared among his disciples when they were all together. And St. Luke tells us that at first they couldn't believe their eyes for sheer joy. And again, after the ascension, he says that the 11 returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Ever since then, joy has been one of the characteristic marks of any authentically Christian life. So, for example, in the Acts, St. Luke tells us that when Christ was preached in Samaria, there was much joy in that city. St. John's Gospel leaves us with the same impression of a deep underlying joy beneath the passion. In his account of our Lord's last talk with his disciples in the upper room, that impression is very strong. "These things have I spoken unto you," he said to them, "that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full." And a few minutes later he said, "You now have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no one taketh away from you." I suppose we usually think of joy simply as an emotion or a mood. And of course there are times when we all feel very joyful. A young man newly fallen in love. A scientist on the crest of some successful bit of research. Any of us on a lovely morning in spring when the world is very gay and everything breathes joy. Anyone can be joyful then. You can't help it. But the Christian possesses an inner source of joy which nothing can disturb. "I will see you again," our Lord says, "and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no one taketh away from you." So, for example, we find St. Paul writing to the Christians at Philippi, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I will say, rejoice." To get the full flavour of those words, you have to remember that they were written by a man who'd been condemned to death in prison where he was awaiting execution. Yet he can still write, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And St. Paul was only following the example of his Lord, for it was on the night of his betrayal, when everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, that Jesus said to his disciples, "These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full." You see, this joy is independent of circumstances, and it is to be ours always. After all, our Lord never promised that in this world we should be delivered from everything difficult and painful. On the contrary, after promising us his joy, almost in the next breath, he told us that we must expect such things. "Remember what I said to you," he says. "The servant is not greater than his Lord. If they've persecuted me, they'll persecute you also." But he did promise that through all such times his joy should remain in us. For our joy, like his, is the fruit of our Easter faith. Our faith that God who rules the universe is the God who raised up Jesus from the dead. Our faith that behind all the turmoil of the world and our pleasant circumstances in which we live, behind all that is the all-powerful love and mercy and wisdom of God controlling and overruling it all. Our faith that the great decisive victory over evil has already been won and that Christ is risen and reigns. There is far too little joy in the world today, perhaps not surprisingly just now. We live in an age which has largely lost the secret of joy because it's lost the secret of Christian faith and hope. So it is part of our Christian duty to exercise the virtue of joy in this 21st century world. But it isn't only that. This great virtue of joy is also vitally important and necessary if we're to live the Christian life at all. A great French saint, St. Francis de Sales, who had a wonderful understanding of human nature, was always emphasizing the importance of cultivating the virtue of joy for just that reason. The journey to our goal is a long one, he says, and sometimes a difficult one. And only a joyous spirit will enable us to persevere to the end. So just as plants, he says, need sunlight and can't grow healthily without it, so is the sunlight of joy necessary for the growth of our inner being, our souls. In his large correspondence, in his letters, of which a great deal has been preserved, he's always insisting on the duty of seeking to grow in the virtue of joy with the help of God's grace. Live joyfully, he writes to someone. Our Lord is looking down on you lovingly. Live joyfully in God. What a splendid motto that would be for a Christian today. Live joyfully in God. And on the other hand, he was always insisting that it is a moral duty to resist that sadness and depression which he describes as an exceptionally dangerous condition of the soul, and to refuse to give in to it. So the first point I want to make is that joy, as the New Testament understands it, is not just a mood or an emotion, but a virtue, which it is our duty to try and grow in with the help of God's grace like any other virtue. That is why joy and a certain gaiety and blitheness of spirit is always one of the characteristic marks of the saints. For as St. Francis de Sales says, if a saint were sorry, he would be a sorry saint. That saying reminds me of a letter which a small black boy wrote about Frank Weston, Bishop of Zanzibar, shortly after his death in 1924. If you see him, he wrote, you know that he's a loving man, because his mouth is always open, ready for laughing. Even in his photos you'll see it, for he's still laughing, and he will laugh forever. There is something hollow and mocking about the laughter of a world without God. Like the hard, joyless laughter of those who are frightened or bored and laugh to try and disguise it. But the laughter of Christians rings sweet and true, like the laughter of children at home in their Father's house, and it rings through eternity. They will laugh forever. Well, what must we do in actual practice to try and grow in this joy, which is the fruit of our Easter faith? For joy must always be the hallmark of the Christian. It's the flag flown in the citadel of the soul to show that the King is in residence. Well, first of all, so far as we can, we must try and dispel our moods of depression, which are due to no fault of our own, by whatever means experience has shown us are likely to be most effective. The essential thing is that we should be taken out of ourselves, and anything that will do that we should welcome. Some people, of course, are temperamentally much more exposed to attacks of depression and melancholy than others are, and therefore have to engage in a perpetual fight against it, which others know nothing about. Sometimes this melancholia is due to psychopathic causes, which need to be treated with medical as well as spiritual help, like any other illness. So far as we can, we must try not to acquiesce in our moods of depression, and never to wallow in them. After all, it's one thing to feel depressed, but it's quite another thing to give in to it completely and to go about like a hardened old Sabbatarian at every Sunday sherry party, radiating gloom. So in practice, that means that we must try to treat thoughts against joy as we try to treat thoughts against charity. That is to say, we must refuse to think about them or to brood over them, which of course is the one thing we find it very hard not to do when we're in that sort of mood. But we must recognize that as a temptation to be resisted. And if, for the sake of others, we try to appear cheerful, even when we're not feeling very cheerful, we may well find that our mood disperses a good deal more quickly than we dared to hope. And then secondly, it is worth remembering that idleness and depression very often go together. We get depressed because we are bored, or because we've got nothing else to think about except ourselves. So honest work, or for that matter, recreation, is often a very good remedy for a fit of depression. Thoroughness in everything we do is a wonderful sort of cheerfulness, just as carelessness is a sort of discontent. Doing something for someone else is perhaps the best remedy of all. No one knows the joy of some small act of unselfish service so much as someone who, if they had allowed themselves to brood over their own troubles, might easily have fallen into a mood of misery and self-pity. And then, lastly, we must try to banish this sadness from our hearts by deliberately cultivating the opposite spirit of thankfulness and confident trust and joy in our prayers and worship. Is any sad among you? St. James asks. Let him pray. But don't pray too much about the things that make you sad, because that would only focus your attention on them. You want to forget them and to think of other things. No doubt Peter and James and John still have plenty of things to get depressed about in that first Easter week if they chose to think about them. But what did anything else really matter compared with the joyful fact of the resurrection? So if we share their living Easter faith, we shall share their Easter joy, and it'll colour all our thinking if it first colours all our prayers. Live joyfully. Christ is risen and reigns, and he has conquered death and sin and evil. Our Lord is looking down on you lovingly. Live joyfully in God. Remember, the Easter story isn't just an account of something that happened a very long time ago. It's a living reality in which you can enter. If you're really trying to live the Easter drama and to play your part in it, you can't help sharing the joy of the risen Lord and the joy of his friends when he made himself known to them. I will see you again, he said to them, the night before he died. Just like the Queen said the other night. We will meet again, and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no one taketh away from you. So when we wish each other a happy Easter, it's not just an empty form of words. How much joy God has given his Easter to millions of humble Christians, whatever circumstances, who are trying to love him. God grant it you, and as the months and years go by, may he increase your joy. Happy Easter.